Every time you breathe, you die a little. Living kills us. What a wonderful way to go. I am AlexFate, and I'm going to ask you a question. You don't need to answer. Sometimes I'll tell you a truth. You may not agree, but it won't be a lie. My views are not said to offend, but they may not be to everyone's cup of tea. Discretion is advised. Now then, shall we begin? There is no such thing as a fact. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a fact. Welcome back to more of my rambling. I'm here with my trusty cup of tea, so I hope you've brought a drink along this time as well. I've just eaten some bread. I made it myself. And that's what the picture is on the front of this video, so you can have a little taste with your eyes. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, there's a lot of things to talk about. So many topics, so many news headlines. In truth, I found it a little difficult to make these recent podcasts. I haven't been sure whether to continue in the same vein or to split, make different types of casts on different types of topics. Maybe some about news, maybe some to redefine the world that we have been told. However, that aside, I found the topic came to me today. I wanted to make some bread. And they say you are what you eat, so I wanted to make the bread the way that I like to make it. And that means I have to walk to the shop. And it means I have to make the bread by hand. No bread maker. It takes some effort, it takes spirit, it takes energy. It takes kneading, in both senses of that word. So to begin, I needed some ingredients, just some eggs and milk. Oh, I needed the milk for my tea, of course. Let me have a sip of my tea and I'll tell you where this story will take us. You might think what the title of this video has to do with bread. Crazy people and you. Well, a while ago I defined madness, or I attempted to. But what about the crazy people? And what about the food that we eat? That's a deep phrase, perhaps. So, let me tell you about my trip to the shop. And the crazy people that I met on my way. I walked to the shop. It took a little while to get there. I am fortunate that I can drive. I could take a bus, I could drive a car, I could hitch a lift. But I chose to walk. And I'm glad I did. It was a beautiful day. I noticed flowers that were blooming in May. They're just they're waking up to the world. Trees were in blossom. I heard birds singing. I even felt the ground under my feet as I walked. I consumed the world as I went along, with my eyes, with my touch, my taste, my smell, the sensations that we have. I think what I'm trying to say is I took time to savour. Like eating some food, either rushing it and getting indigestion, or taking time to allow the tastes to mix and be pleasurable. And my walk was pleasurable. So I took my walk, and in truth it doesn't matter what the street was like. You can picture your street. Maybe you live in a busy urban environment and there are cars racing by, there are people pushing up and down, there are narrow pavements and noise everywhere. There's just noise, distractions. But you can take what you like from that. You can see the beauty of how a wall was put together, how the weeds growing between the pavements are life, and how the noise is life. Or fighting, baying to be heard the most. Or perhaps you live in the countryside and you walk along a narrow path, but one that is muddy, worn between the grass. Perhaps you slip and slide as you walk, or maybe the mud is dry and you kick up dust with your feet. Wherever you walk, picture going to that shop. Picture your shop and think about walking there. You're not taking a car, you're not taking a bus, you're not having a lift. You're walking. It's going to take time to get there. Why not savor that journey? I'll have a sip of tea and I'll tell you what was round the corner. So the walk took a while, and every time I'm walking there I know when I walk back I'm going to be carrying the shopping, the heavy bags. How fortunate I will be to be carrying back good food. So I approached the shop and I turned the corner. And on the side of the road is a man. There are people in different places, but this one man in particular is just standing there. He isn't racing from point to point. He isn't standing at a cash point or rushing from a car or doing anything that all the other people are doing. He's just standing. And as I get a bit closer, I see he's doing a bit more than standing. He's actually dribbling, drooling. There is spittle falling out of his mouth. I do not think he knows this. Most people walk past him quickly. I slow. And I say hello. And excuse me, because I may sneeze in a moment. So this will be a new experience for you on my podcast, a live sneeze. I think I may be okay. Proof that I'm not editing. So as I walk up to this man, to save his identity, or maybe not, I'll call him Michael. And the point here is that I know his name. He isn't just a crazy man on the side of the road dribbling and drooling. He's a person. And so I say, "Hi, Michael." And he says hello back and asks me how I am, and I give a brief reply. But I engage in conversation. Briefly. Because I've met him before in different locations. The first time that I saw Michael, he told me that he was a doctor. a very highly qualified doctor. And he was very believable. He was also a liar. Michael lives in his own little world, his own reality. He doesn't do harm to anyone, but he doesn't fit in either. I remember one moment when I was in a room that had partitions and Michael was behind them. He was shouting and screaming. There was no one else there. I think it's time for a sip of tea. Have you seen any crazy people recently? Well, how many crazy people have you seen? What is crazy anyway? I guess you could say that if you're in a room with partitions and you're hid behind them and you're shouting and screaming, that's probably crazy. Or it's definitely what most people would call as being crazy. And they would have been afraid because he was quite... It sounded violent when he was shouting. But the point is that he isn't violent. He is just a man who has problems. And those problems may limit his abilities. But he isn't a violent person. He's just a person with problems. And we all have problems. How much those problems interfere with our day-to-day life is perhaps the measure of if those problems become a problem. Anyway, I moved on. After all, I was going to get some bread. Or I was going to get something to make bread and have a cup of tea. So I got into the store and I'm walking up and down the aisles. It's not a big store, but there are still thousands of products in front of me. I know what I want. I want some eggs and I want some milk. It's not that difficult. Oh, but look, there are some nice peaches over there, fresh, and some bananas. Tomatoes. Cheese. Oh, cheesecake. You know what it's like when you go into a store and you go in for a loaf of bread, and before you know it, you've got a whole trolley full of food. Well, I carried a basket just to make sure. But you can't help those offers, can you? They're not only designed to grab our attention. Times are hard. We all need to save a few pennies here and there and get 2 for the price of 3. I know I mean 3 for the price of 2, but I wonder sometimes. Is it 2 for the price of 3? Just because they say a price and they say a quantity, are they telling us the truth? I picked up some mushrooms. They were £1 a punnet. £1 an easy number. How can you go wrong at £1? They'd sell anything for £1, as they do in the pound shop. But what about these crazy people? So I'm stood, reaching up for these mushrooms. And there's a man in front of me, looking at what turned out to be asparagus. And he turns right round and stares at me and starts telling me, "You wouldn't believe the price of these asparagus. You wouldn't believe where they come from. It's unbelievable." And again, I think most people would have nodded politely or smiled and moved to the next aisle pretty quick. But I'm a sucker for a good conversation. So I agree with him. And then we talk about asparagus. He tells me how asparagus is grown in this country, that we are known for it, and it is the season of asparagus. Great British asparagus. And he would have thought that the supermarket would be selling it, and he was surprised that they didn't sell British asparagus. I was not surprised, and I told him. I stopped being surprised a long time ago at things like that. But the conversation grew. He wouldn't let me go away, and I couldn't help but engage. So the conversation drifted. He ended up going on to politics, but the price of food, the type of food that we have, where it comes from, and he was saying, how could asparagus come from China, for example? I don't remember the actual place where it did come from. But how could it come from over the seas, where it has to be transported overseas? It has to be grown, it has to be marketed, it has to be packaged. He was amazed at the price. But he still thought that the local homegrown produce could have been sold instead, and cheaper. Even though he knew that those abroad would be paid, well, if only they were paid. I don't know what they would have got, but it would definitely not have been what we would call a wage. So I couldn't help but tell him about pencils, which I'll tell you as well after I sip my tea. You see, I've mentioned before, and for those who have heard me on my many, many, many podcasts, maybe you've heard me say about pencils. I can remember being a teenager many lives ago, and pencils were cheap. They were so cheap. And I remember seeing they were made in China. And back then I looked and I thought, how can they do this? How can they make these pencils so cheap, all the way from the other side of the world? I mean, they had to get the wood, they had to get graphite and fashion them together, they had to have machineries, factories, fabrication. I believe the pencils were even coloured, so they had to use some form of pigment, dyes, paints, and then they had to store them and take them to container ships and ship them across the world, send them to our shops by vehicles that needed oil and fuel and money and people that needed wages. And then they put them in the shops, and they may have even packaged them, at least in a box. I mean, you wouldn't have a million pencils just dropping out of a container. And after all that, they had to go into the shop and be sold to make a profit. And I can remember when I was young, looking at these pencils and thinking, how can they do that? That's been a thought that stayed with me for many years. If I'd said it to people a long time ago, they would have told me that it's obvious. There is nothing obvious, by the way. But people would say it is obvious, and they would say, oh, it's mass production. It's mass masses of scale that you can't imagine with your tiny little head. Mass volume, mass production, and tiny wages. And they would tell me that these things together meant that the pencils could be made and shipped and sold from China to England and still make a profit. And yet I looked at that pencil and I didn't really believe the people that were telling me it was obvious. Because the pencil told me otherwise. Anyway, I mentioned this to the asparagus man, and he turns to me, and he gave me the answer which I now believe, or at least I think is the most likely of answers, rather than a belief. And he just said, yes, lost leaders. I smiled, because I've mentioned the pencil example many times and no one has ever come straight back with that answer to me. Yes, a lost leader, a product that is sold at a loss, but a loss so that other things can be sold at a profit to get you into the market. And the tricky thing with that is most people will see a lost leader, if they recognize the term, as something that happens maybe over a year, maybe a month. Something on offer that is clearly on offer. It's a bargain. It's something that wasn't there before, and suddenly, lo and behold, it is. It's called marketing. Good marketing. People will buy anything for £1. So if you put the price low enough, people will buy it. It doesn't really matter what it is. As I put my mushrooms into my basket for £1, did I know where they came from? Did I know if they were good or not? Or the farmer, anything? Had they been sprayed? Were they GMO? What were these mushrooms? I don't know. I just went £1, put them in my basket. They looked nice. But what if a lost leader is a long-term strategy? Because when I was young, those pencils would have been so cheap, and people would have noticed the pencils from China. But not now. And this isn't an anti-China rant. This is about what we eat, what we consume, and if we are aware of what we eat. Because what we eat is what we are. So let's say, hypothetically, that these pencils were part of a larger scheme to get products, not pencils, but products, into the market in this country. So you sell the pencils, you build up the links, you lose money. You might lose money for years. That's the difficult thing to think of, that it could be for years you are losing money. But in 5 years, you aren't just making money. You're owning the market. You're beginning to take it. And before you know it, the shirt that you buy, the car that you buy, the shoes, the food, and still the pencils are made in China. Ah, yes. And I'll just say briefly, what if that is the same for so many things? And by things I do not mean products. We could talk ideas being sold as lost leaders, political ideologies. We could be talking of a whole framework of society being sold to us as lost leaders, so we buy it, We take it on board, and then before you know it, you are in that sea. You have become what you have consumed. You are what you eat. Or what you drink. My tea is almost done. So, the conversation that we had, as it seemed to continue, had drawn some attention, I noticed. The security guard was watching us. And have you ever noticed, maybe you haven't, but have you ever noticed when a security guard watches someone, they often like to be seen themselves, to be noticed. It's a quiet form of encouragement to stop what you're doing and just continue consuming, consumption, buy, follow the lines, follow the signs. It's a very subtle form of intimidation. Just stand and stare at someone and you'll see what I mean. There's a reaction. Well, the security guard stood and stared rather, and we chatted still for a while. And the conversation drifted on to politics. Now think about that. You meet a random guy in a supermarket complaining about the asparagus, and before you know it, they're talking about politics. And many people would have walked past that man too. And I admit we could have stayed for a long time talking, and that was not my intention because I had bread to make. Many people would have said he was overpowering, obnoxious perhaps. Maybe some would have said crazy. I think he was lonely. I think all he wanted was to share. Whether it was asparagus, political ideas, his life history, telling me about the shirt that he bought for £1 and it fell apart the next day. He just wanted to share. People can be so lonely. All they need is a few caring words, that's all. And yet, if we do that, we can have security people staring at us, telling us subtly to move along, continue shopping please. This is a shop, you are in a shop, you have rules here, you are free, move along. You are free, continue shopping. You are free, you have stood and talked long enough now. Can you remember an age when people went to the shop? And do you know what they did? Maybe before television and mobile phones and the internet and computers filled our heads with noise, the people talked, they gossiped, they had conversations. The shops were a meeting place. They were a meeting place of life where people shared life. And we've forgotten that. We're scared to have a conversation with strangers when all they want to do is talk and share life. Even for 1 minute, not £1, 1 minute. So I would say that we are what we eat. But we are born consumers, and we eat more than food. What do you eat? In your day-to-day life, what do you eat? Are you eating time? Are you eating the traffic? Are you eating the rush to the supermarket, the standing in the queue, the waiting at the aisle, the packaging, the scanning of the food, the placing in the basket, the taking to the car, the going to the home, the parking, the transport? What are you eating every day of your life? And what do you taste? What do you savour? I will sip my last drop of tea. It is good. Well, I made it home and I made some bread, as I said, with my hands, with a little electric, and to share as much as I can of that is my picture for this video. Thank you for joining me again and taking time to listen, to share. And why not think what it is that you eat, and if you are indeed what you consume. Thank you. Bye for now.